Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ewan Ferguson, and I'm the facilitator for this National Aerial Firefighting Centre Strategic Committee webinar series. I'd like to welcome you all to this first webinar. And before we get into the business of the webinar, I'd like to recognise the traditional owners and the land on which we meet, and pay our respects to the traditional elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to recognise the sacrifices by everyone over the last fire season, and in particular the loss of 3 lives of our American colleagues in the C-130 crash in New South Wales, and we recognise their significant contribution and thank them for it. This webinar was originally planned as a fire and industry workshop to be held in November 2019. That was postponed due to bushfires in Queensland and New South Wales. A second attempt in April 2020 was postponed due to COVID-19 restrictions. It's now been proposed that we have a program of aerial firefighting, and there'll be 3 open invitation webinars followed by a invitation only interactive workshop. Today is the first webinar. We'll have Chris Arnold from the Tasmanian Fire Service, who's also the chair of the NAFC Strategic Committee, and Chris will introduce the issues from his perspective as a director and as the Chief Officer of Tas Fire Service. He'll be followed by Matt Blasinski with the CSIRO, who will give an update on the current status of aerial firefighting research. Following this webinar, in 2 weeks' time, on the 13th of August, there will be another webinar with the industry view. Phil Hurst from the Australian Aerial Application Association and Ray Cronin of the Australian Helicopter Industry Association will present at that webinar on the 13th of August. And then on the 3rd of September, the webinar will move to the results of a survey which has been conducted by the NAFC Strategic Committee. We'll be presenting those findings and also considering any recommendations forthcoming from the Royal Commission or from other inquiries. We'll also be hearing from Josephine Sterling and Richard Alder of NAFC, and then from Stuart Ellis, CEO of AFUE, on the proposed aerial firefighting strategy. And then the 4th event in this series will be an interactive workshop by invitation hosted by AFUE, and I think the planned date is the 17th of September. Please note this webinar will be recorded, and after the event we'll send you a link to access so you can replay that recording. We're asking to hold all questions until after the speakers have finished, and after the speakers have finished, we'll ask that you use the chat box, which is one of the facilities of Zoom, and you post your questions, and then I'll try my best to moderate the question and answer. So first up this afternoon is Chief Officer Chris Arnold of the Tasmania Fire Service. Chris joined the Tasmania Fire Service as a recruit firefighter in 1985. In 2009, he moved to Western Australia, where he was Assistant Commissioner for Country Operations. Chris achieved a number of achievements in WA, including driving the new Department of Fire and Emergency Services. Chris was awarded a Churchill Fellowship in 2007 for his studies into the rural-urban interface fires. He was appointed Chief Officer and Chief Executive of the Tasmania Fire Service on the 21st of March 2016, and since then his focus has been on a fresh agenda for emergency service integration, legislative reform and business development. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Chris, and we'll hand over to Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Ewan. I hope everyone can hear me, and I know we're having a little technical trouble. I'll try and press on this PowerPoint as we go. Thank you, everyone else, for zooming in today as well. I think I've got something. So, what today I thought I'd talk about is last season wasn't the worst fire season for the Tasmanian Fire Service. It was actually the one before. Was probably the latest of the worst fire seasons that we've had. From a TFS perspective, I'll talk about that, and then end with a couple of observations from a chief's point of view and from the NAFC chair point of view. Okay, I'll have to be a bit slow. Beg your pardon. I want to prefix my comments with this slide that I don't see any one activity as a silver bullet. And we've got a number of weapons in our firefighting armoury from a bushfire point of view, and often referred to as a total solutions package. And if you look at, making it hard for fire to reach assets is going to be fuel reduction. Building codes will give us, make it hard for the buildings to catch fire. Today we're going to focus on effective response, and I think it's also important that the partnership we actually have is not just between us and industry, it's actually the community, and their behaviour and what they do is really quite important. And a bit of a good news story to start with. If I look back at our large air tankers and how we've been using them, this was a first for Tassie. So I'm pushing back now to 2017. We had a fire at St Helens on the East Coast, and we had one very similar in 2006, and this was the Argonaut Road fire. There were $20 million worth of forestry assets at risk. We'd had some homes threatened at the time, and Scamander, which is a tourism destination, was completely in the way of this fire. So with 6 well-planned, well-executed lat drops, we completely stopped this fire. It was well past the initial attack stage. We had to plan to catch it at the right time. But it was totally justifiable. I was first told it was going to cost about $2.4 million, but it didn't end up to be that at all. Compared to the 2006 fires, what we had was a fire that was kept to a quarter. Getting ahead of, that's not me, someone else is doing it. Getting it to compare to the 2006 fires, we contained the fire about a quarter of the size. And the 2006 fires threatened dozens of communities in the Fingal Valley and wiped out a town called 4 Mile Creek and took months to extinguish. So there's no question in my mind that aircraft are a major advance in our sector, but I think we could be seduced by some oversimplification of their capability, which I might talk about in a minute. I'm looking at our shifting operating model, which is a slide now in front of you. Just a couple of points about environmental factors in perhaps a contemporary setting that I'll quickly touch on. When we were established as fire authorities at the turn of the 20th century, fire stations were placed in each town, and intuitively we probably got it right. And in those days, you could just send the first truck out, go around the corner and put the fire out, and the world was good. And with our volunteer numbers, whilst there's some discussion about volunteer numbers are going up and down, ours have remained static. In Tasmania, we have 5,000 volunteer bushfire fighters, and that's always been the case, certainly over the last 20 years. And the issue, of course, is that people need to understand how to run a volunteer organisation. There's the assumption that they'll be available all the time, anytime. Well, what we find, of course, if you look at the daily cycle, we can get a lot of work out of volunteers in the evenings, but they're not going to be readily available necessarily for daytime operations. But the second factor about volunteers is their distribution and to rethink response. And we've done that to some extent because we've migrated our volleys, and it's a national issue. Volleys have migrated to the larger towns and cities. And what we're finding now, we still need the boots on the ground to put the fires out, but the tactical approach has shifted a little bit. So to use aircraft to hold the fire until we can get enough on numbers, particularly noting the more volatile fire behaviour, we need to be sort of sending strike teams to hold fires these days rather than just, the nearest fire truck around the corner to grab it in an initial attack. It doesn't seem to always work. So what I'm saying is there's been a shift there. The federal government its focus, of course, is on resilience. But what I can say is weight of attack works. So looking at the slide there, we talk about pre-positioning strike teams. I'm sure we all do this type of thing. We've double-weighted further, increased our mobilisation on bad days, and we have aircraft in immediate response to hold the fire essentially till we get there. Again, this confirms for me that aircraft are a very important advance in our sector. And I must say, on days of total fire ban, we have stopped, in the last 4 years since I've been appointed, we've stopped every fire, every new start, we've stopped them under this. So when we're into fire behaviour, fire danger indices of severe to extreme, we're able to hold it. We can't, of course, obviously we wouldn't do it, be able to manage that in catastrophic, and we need to change our strategy. What I'm saying here though, the point is, whilst the federal government is looking to say, let's invest in recovery, in resilience rather than recovery, we do still need to invest in effective fire attack. And the investment that we've been putting up to date has been really good. There are, however, some metrics that we need to look at, and I've been questioned, I'll come to it shortly in another slide. We don't have the metrics on what's the optimal operational weight of attack. So in our 18-19 review, the AFAC recommendations were that we did explore that. So we haven't established any standards yet. Trying to move again. Okie dokie. I'll now move to what happened in 18-19 for Tasmania, which was our bigger fire season than last year. We had, as you can see, here's an example of dry lightning that we had come through a couple of times. We had this also in 15-16, and the dry lightning these days, under this new climate change phenomenon that we're seeing, or perhaps just the change that we're seeing, this left us with about 70 fires, 70 ignitions. Once it would have left us with just 7 or so. So that's what we're seeing as a difference. So that means we have to learn to live with this. How are we going to deal with lightning that's going to leave us with all these multiple ignitions? I think aircraft, particularly in remote locations, are going to play a big part in this going forward. And in fact, in Tasmania, we're working on what we call, or I'm calling a lightning strategy to deal with that. So I look at this one. You can see the fire scars there in grey on this map. So it left us with, eventually over that summer, we had 115 individual bushfires, an 85-day campaign. I know you can see what's in front of you there. 210,000 hectares. Now, the important bit to me is I point to at the bottom, which is where it counts, is the aircraft cost a lot of money, no question. In fact, it was approximately 50% of the firefighting costs that year were aircraft. Now, of course, my political masters and in fact Treasury are really wanting me to justify what I'm doing with that, either post or going forward with adjusting aircraft as a suppression medium. Again, that's back to having the metrics, having the research and so on, and I know that's going to be spoken about by Matt shortly as to where we are there. What I'll also note down here, the fire damage to the ratio, so the community costs were 20 million, firefighting was nearly 60 million, but I compare this to 1967, and that's why I bring this one up, because 210,000 hectares compared to 67, which was 268,000 hectares. 62 people died in Tasmania, 7,000 were homeless or displaced in Tasmania in 1962 for a comparable fire, is what I'm saying. So in this fire, there was no loss of life. 6 homes were, and I regret losing anything, of course, but 6 homes were lost, but limited damage to infrastructure. We had considerable concerns about power infrastructure north and south of the state and east and west across the state, which we had to put specific strategies in to protect. And aircraft played, again, a big part in that. But still, firefighting is shrouded in mystery, and there is this ever-increasing demand on us for transparency, the visibility. That year, this was the aircraft we had on the 1st of February. So there's 38 aircraft we had in the state. We were normally setting up with, we got about 30 call when needed, and we would contract 7 aircraft through NAFC for the year. We eventually got to almost 50 aircraft that summer. So really, we virtually had more aircraft than we knew what to do with. And the importance is knowing what to do with them. So it's a little bit early for us. And in the fog of war, we're a bit reactive and we misplaced some of those air assets. We weren't using them as effectively as we wanted. Back to this question of weight of response or effectiveness. The first large air tanker drop that we put in was in button grass. Right. It didn't work. It didn't stop the fire, in fact. That's it, perhaps not the point. The point is button grass doesn't matter. It didn't matter that we could have let that burn. In fact, we did have fires burn in button grass all year and we didn't worry about it because they weren't of value to us. So it's a bit of a values proposition there. But in this case, and you can see a bit of our lake system there, we discovered the benefits of scooping aircraft, say fire bosses, and it meant to me that we required further analysis of what our air fleet looked like, particularly our NAFC contract and what we thought we needed, as an observation from the Chief Officer. So going back to the criticisms of that season, I have put all the criticisms, and there weren't many. There was 9 recommendations out of what we call initially was an AFAC peer review, but it became the government's review, and they extended the terms of preference to include public commentary or public submissions. But we needed an air desk for good contract and good contract management, so that's in place. Remote area response protocols were required and needed to be improved, and I've spoken about those to some extent because that's our challenge going forward in our state with lightning storms going through. And back to that issue of standards for initial attack and you know, what's too much, what's too little. And I know there is some subjectivity to that. And a decision on whether we're going to use winching for remote teams and so on. There was a recommendation that we use volunteer, got it, I'm nearly there, Ewan. There's a decision that we use winching aircraft, or we consider winching aircraft. At the political level, this meant that the conservation movement down here, of course, there was a significant green movement. They were really concerned about our performance in initial attack, parks, sustainable timber, Tasmania and TFS. And they really wanted us to cover that initial attack and multiple remote fires. So this means what sort of detection do we use? What sort of response do we have? I think that, again, calls up aircraft. So the next year, which is last year, well, where had all the aircraft gone? In fact, we couldn't get them. Aircraft we wanted, we couldn't get because they were being consumed by Australia. And as you can see by this map leading into the summer, we weren't expecting to get a lot of help from our mainland counterparts because it was clearly going to be very busy. And it did prove to be the case. I think I've spoken about most of the issues on that slide already. And we have looked at continuing to grow our air operations capability. The game changes I see looking that I'm really interested personally in seeing how we go with those 9 observations, how we're going to go with whatever we end up calling them, but drones essentially, and how they're going to help us in future. I think they're game changers. There's excitement there. There's other IT things that we can use. If I look at my observations, I've pretty well covered those, I think, from a Chief Officer's point of view. What I really did notice here is that incident management teams, I've got to get skills into those because they don't really understand aircraft capability. They were hesitant to release aircraft, lack of confidence, and they would leave them on the ground and not even use them. So there's efficiencies in there to be seeking. We wasted pilot hours because we were incorrectly deploying them and so on. There's just those efficiencies within the business. I think we have to be able to communicate the efficacy of aircraft very clearly to the public and the minister so that they are appropriately informed of what this means and how it plays the right part in our response. If I look at it from a NAFC point of view, back to that values proposition, again, the aircraft efficacy, we need that research, we need the economic modelling to justify the decisions. I think I can justify it anecdotally, but it'd be nice to have more concrete information. We have been working on it from a NAFC point of view. I know that, but I think that's there's more work to be done there. We need to consider the purchase lease options. I know New South Wales has gone through that, which way is the best way to go, or if in fact in part. The national strategy, I'm looking forward to Stuart's discussion later on. We're talking about what our national deployment and sharing of aircraft is. So we've got to rethink our role, perhaps, of NAFC around there. The Royal Commission's going to have, I suspect, a few implications in our structure, and I wonder what, and I do know they are actually thinking about some of the national approach to, say, aircraft in particular, and making decisions around priorities for various states. So perhaps I could say, for example, if Traralgon's on fire and Hobart's at threat and there's only one lap left, when I was appearing in front of the Commission, they were getting down to that level. I don't necessarily see it's quite like that, and it hasn't proven to be like that in previous seasons. I spoke about the EMA strategies. I think we need to maintain, well, it is clear that we need to maintain our federal relationships. It's critical because half our money is coming, well, a lot of our money is coming from there. And like I said, maximise the business value. There's impacts of COVID-19 going forward. I know we rely a lot on aircraft from overseas for our summer operations. So I think the webinar series, I think we're going to look at initially, Ewan, seeking perhaps industry and provider perspective. Look forward to the next webinar in respect of industry, and we should be asking ourselves the question is, yeah, what should we look like tomorrow? So that's probably all I've got, my friend, and thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and some terrific points there. Clearly, the effects of climate change have changed the game for you, and your strategies, you know, the fact that you're looking for a value proposition, and it's not just you as a Chief of a Fire Service, but your government. So some really good points there, Chris. And Chris, you'll hang on for the chat and the questions at the end of the webinar. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Matt Plasinski of CSIRO. Matt is a senior research scientist in the CSIRO Bushfire Behaviour and Risks Group. He obtained a PhD from the University of New South Wales in 2003, with his thesis focusing on ignition thresholds in heathland fuels. Since joining CSIRO in 2004, Matt's primary research interests have been bushfire suppression and behaviour. Matt has developed bushfire suppression success models using operational data, made field measurements of fire behaviour for suppression effectiveness on wildfires with a focus on aerial suppression. He has also conducted live fire field and lab experiments, led the evaluation of a large air tanker, and developed fire behaviour prediction software. Matt is also an experienced volunteer bushfire firefighter. So welcome, Matt, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ewan. Here we go with the third time lucky for this presentation. This presentation is really just focused on the research on aerial firefighting effectiveness, not on other aspects of aerial firefighting, such as other aspects such as safety or economic efficiency or that sort of stuff. And it's going to be biased towards Australia and probably a little bit towards my own work as well, because that's what I'm most familiar with. So, okay, I've got a lot to cover in the time allotted. There's a bit of a quick overview here. I've defined recent as in about 15 years, in the last 15 years. That's sort of the period where NAFC's been around. It's also the inception of the Bushfire CRC and that work, and also my own work in the field. I'm going to have a quick look at some older stuff just because I think it's relevant and good. There's been some good work that's worth mentioning there. And I also want to look at how the research has been used and where we could improve our knowledge. So firstly, what is suppression effectiveness? And it's a difficult one to define, and it's one that's, yeah, I guess can be defined in a lot of different ways. And it really depends, you know, I guess most people would define it on their objectives of the suppression, but it also depends on the scale of inquiry. And I was asked to put a couple of articles together for a journal. It came out last year, and I really had to think about how to frame it, and the scale thing was really important there. And I guess I'm going to be talking about the research, and a lot of the stuff has to be done on a small scale. So it might even be in a lab or at the scale of a drop. And in those sort of scales, you're really considering things like the effect on fire behaviour. Whereas at an incident, you might be concerned about the actual objectives for the incident. And at a larger scale, you can consider initial attack success rates across the broader landscape. I've got a summary of those reports as a 2-pager for, we put out these Pyro page things that you can access quickly, and some of the stuff that I refer to is probably a little bit more digestible in that form rather than the long-winded scientific stuff. So back to the older stuff, and this is, I guess, international research that's it's been around for a long time. It's worth having a look, and this stuff, there's been a lot of good work done, and it's also evolved into what we do now and how we practice that work. And I guess some of the early work, particularly led by the US Forest Service, but also other nations like Canada, they did a lot of work in retardants and looking into retardant formulations, defining testing protocols, which have sort of ended up with a qualified products list and that sort of thing. They also did a lot of work on aircraft delivery systems, looking into the cup and grid test and what makes a good drop, what a flow rate's like, and that sort of thing. And probably the most significant work done in that period in the 80s was the Operational Retardant Effectiveness Program, where they actually went out into the field and tried to measure stuff on real wildfires. And they struggled to sort of, I guess, get some of their goals there, but they did come up with some good stuff, like the 10 principles of retardant application that really sort of drives a lot of effective use of retardant, particularly in their own organisation in the United States. But there's also been some significant research done in Australia over the years, and back in 1982, my predecessors in CSIRO did the first evaluation of a large air tanker. It was pretty limited study because it was one season, and these things seem to happen on the fire seasons that ended up being the quiet ones. But they did come up with this insightful quote that I found in the conclusion section that probably has some relevance these days still. Following that, they went to a more experimental project with the Project Aquarius, which was done by CSIRO and the Victorian agencies, and that was motivated by being a cost-benefit study, and they wanted to look into you know, was it worth bringing big air tankers over and using them, but they took a really good approach in that they realised there were things that they needed to know before they could answer that sort of question. And so they wanted to know things about the productivity of aircraft and what sort of intensity thresholds, what sort of fire behaviour that they could be effective under. And so that was defined under fire line intensity. And they looked into what range of fire retardant lines in particular could hold the fire, and they found that it was very similar to what you'd expect a road or something like that to hold up to a fire particularly. And they noted very much that that was benefited by having ground suppression crews on the ground within an hour after the drop. So that was some pretty good work done back then. And Victoria have done a little bit more work in the 90s, and they looked into the effectiveness of operations on specific incidents by asking firefighters and incident controllers how they thought that the aircraft benefited different jobs. And we applied that approach a little bit later that I'll talk about. So moving on to more recent research, I guess I'm starting here with the Bushfire CRC project, which I assume a lot of you guys will be familiar with. I certainly am, because it had a pretty significant role in sort of my career. But this project had some pretty bold objectives. I don't think we quite got there with some of them, but we wanted to look further into fire behaviour thresholds, which we really didn't get an opportunity to do. That's more of an experimental sort of thing, and you need to do lots of, get lots of data to do that from experiments. We also wanted to look at optimising resource use and efficiency and develop operational guidelines. And we started with a literature review, and in that literature review, we identified that the main advantages of aircraft over ground suppression was speed, access, and observation, and that was quite important. And we applied a few different methods, and these are the main methods we looked at. We tried to get to Operation Wildfires and do some measurements. We tried to conduct field experiments, and we also did a strategic level operations study, which was similar to that work done in Victoria. And I'll talk about all of them, starting with the field evaluation here. So we started off with a few field experiments in Tasmania in 2005 with the TFS. We had some pretty mild conditions and small plots, but it gave us the opportunity to damn it, I'm talking about the wrong thing here, but first, sorry, I was meant to talk about the case fire value, the case studies in the going to wildfires, and really we had a crack at this, and it was quite difficult to get to fires in time and to get there safely and to actually make some good measurements. So we in the end, after some putting in a fair bit of effort, we realised there wasn't really much return for that effort. And I wanted to acknowledge, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, that the current technology is more suitable for collecting data in the field and getting field observations from others in the field. So now I'll talk about the experiments. So after we did those ones in Tasmania, we followed up with doing some more experiments in South Australia, and we wanted to look at comparing some retardants and foam and gel and see how they compared, and that was quite difficult to do in the field, and it's not really feasible in that although the great thing about field experiments is you can measure lots of stuff, you can't quite control everything that you want to take care of. And even though we had reasonably similar conditions on different burn days, the little differences in weather and fire behaviour make a big difference in the effect on suppression, which means that you're not really doing fair comparisons, and some of that sort of work is better off done in the field. Nonetheless, we did collect a fair bit of good data, and we were able to define the breaching mechanisms, and that was related to spotting and burn around and burn through. And we came up with a drop evaluation guide and a paper that supports that. And later used these methods for evaluating the DC-10 air tanker in Victoria for the Victorian agencies. And that was a little bit driven by their objectives, and they wanted to look at using retardant lines from a large air tanker for stopping flank fires and for stopping head fires. And we found a few shortcomings there with the holes in drops and that sort of thing. But one thing that sort of all this work sort of does make you realise that if you want to evaluate a resource like this, it really needs to be done in the field. It's not a desktop exercise. You need to sort of do the experiment and see how it goes, and make sure you measure it, and that's the only way you can sort of be defensible with that sort of thing. So I'm just taking a quick sidestep here about doing work in the lab, since I sort of mentioned the experiments. And in the lab gives you that extra degree of control that you don't get in the field. So this is a photo of the CSIRO Pyrotron, which is a big wind tunnel, and there's a burning section in that where you can sort of control the wind speed and control the conditions that you light fires in, and you can also control the fuel moisture content and things like that. So you can pretty much light the same fire over and over and over again and do different things to it to see how it compares. So we've got a this was a project that we did for Victorian Aviation Services Unit, and then later NAFC, which was to compare some different suppressants. And it's sort of building on some of the methodology that the US Forest Service used for retardant evaluation, but here we're using a direct application. We've got a fuel bed of just eucalypt litter, and we've got the same fire that we're burning over and over again, and then we're hitting it in the suppression in a zone where we can spray the suppressant on there, and we can measure the volume of suppressant that we're using each time. And here we're using that volume to measure effectiveness, I guess, of the suppression, and we're able to compare the different suppressants by the volume that we used. And so this is the results, and I don't expect you to read too much into it, but the horizontal dashed line there is the result for water, and the other box plots show the different products that we tested. And so the ones that are below that water line are better than water. And so the best product that we tested, you know, using those criteria, only used about 40% of the volume of water to extinguish the same fire, which seems pretty good. There's a write-up of that in a CSIRO Pirate page, in a 2-pager too, if you're interested. So now I've moved back to the CRC project and the strategic level operations study. Now I expect a few people watching this would have filled in some of these data collection forms for us. We were unable to get a lot of the data that required from existing agency systems. So we needed to ask people what they thought that happened at fires and get some more information on fuels, timing into deployments, and particularly things like area burn and initial attack. And that data was really useful for us, and it allowed us to do some studies on particularly looking at initial attack success. So for this study, we're looking at initial attack success as the main measure of effectiveness. It's more at that landscape scale. And these are the results. And to be honest, they're not surprising. They should be pretty obvious to everyone, particularly people that are experienced fire management or aviation specialists. It's telling you things like small fires are easier to put out than big ones, which is a bit of a catchphrase from my career. There's also telling you things like response timing is important. One thing, in particular, this plot on the right there does show you is that fuel is important, and so fuel management is important. It has an impact on how hard it is to put for suppression to take place, and your suppression is more likely to be successful when you've got fuels with a lower hazard rating than it is in, say, something that's left unmanaged and long unburnt. So even though we are sort of stating the obvious in a lot of these results, we're doing it in a quantitative way, and it's independent evidence that's you know, supported by science. So we took this to, I guess, a slightly different level by in those evaluation forms, we were asking people what they thought would have happened at fires if they didn't have aircraft, and so we could do some comparisons there. And we wanted to look at when do aircraft make a difference. And so we did that study, and I guess it's summarised in this quote here that aerial suppression is most effective in reducing fire containment time when wildfire suppression conditions are difficult because of fuel hazard rating, weather conditions, slow resource response times, and area burning at initial attack. So it's giving that extra capability to the ground resources. And Chris mentioned about the volunteer availability aspect, and there's a lot in those sort of observations in that when you need that little bit of an extra push from the suppression, adding the aircraft is quite beneficial, you know, whether it be ground crews taking longer to get to a fire because it's just harder to get to your place, or they're not as available at the particular time. There might be concurrent fires or anything like that. So it's that little bit of extra capability, and particularly at that initial attack phase. So we put together this fire containment calculator, which is an Excel spreadsheet. And it was designed to predict the probability of initial attack success at different times fires with some simple information that you might know at the first report of a fire or the first sit rep that you might get back, and you can make a prediction what the probability of initial attack success is with just ground resources and what it is with aircraft as well. And so the ground resources here is the green line on this plot, and the blue line is with aircraft as well. And so if there's a big difference between those lines, then it's probably worthwhile deploying aircraft to the fire. And that was, I guess, what we designed that for. Moving on to sort of other work since then, this is a project that I did for EMV last year to sort of coincide with their night suppression operations project. And here I was asked to sort of look at the window of opportunity. This plot on the right here goes from noon to noon, so midnight's in the middle, in the night time sort of highlighted by the darker area there. But essentially, it's applying those suppression effectiveness thresholds that came up with the Project Aquarius, and applying that to fire data for a bunch of fires that were burned overnight in Victoria, that included the ones they did deploy the aircraft to, and other ones that have been sort of fires that have taken significant runs overnight. But still, sort of, it identifies that yes, there is a greater opportunity for suppression overnight in those when conditions are milder on most fires. So, you know, again, stating the obvious, but sort of quantifying it in some regard. Moving on to work done by other people internationally, there's been a bit of modelling done on drop patterns in different places in Europe there. This is sort of to take over from the cup and grid test, which can be difficult and laborious to undertake. And just, I don't know if this sort of work is being applied operationally or for evaluation, but just stating it because it's out there. Another paper that was published this year. This is the first project that's actually used tracking data from GPSs inside of air tankers, and this example comes from Ontario in Canada, where they've looked at the amphibious aircraft, and they've found like a linear relationship between response time and distance, which is, again, is something you would expect. And they've got a pretty aggressive initial attack strategy over there, and also they've got lakes and lakes everywhere and short turnaround times. And as a result, they've sort of found that for most fires, they only really require aircraft for a couple of hours, and then they've got on top of them. Of course, there are the odd ones that get away, but the bulk of them are in that sort of shorter time period. Now moving back to the United States and US Forest Service, which is still a big players here. This is a few papers that have looked at perceptions of aircraft use within agencies, and they're and within the broader community. And this research has sort of found that suppression costs are higher near built areas than they are in other areas. And although they recognise that a lot of that's due to, I guess, the heightened need for use of aircraft in sort of defensive roles for property protection and that sort of thing, there's also acknowledging that there's a lot of sort of public, media and political pressure to be seen to be deploying aircraft to fires. And I guess and so, yeah, people want to see suppression, and of course aircraft are the most conspicuous form of suppression. Some other papers also done by the US Forest Service in the last few years. They're very interested in how LATs are being used. And some of this is motivated by their wanting to see how, are they being used for the same reasons that they've to meet with the, I guess, the policies, you know, are they being used in the initial attack and that. And so there are some findings here that although they're intended for initial attack, they are being used a lot more on extended attack and larger fires. Initial attack containment rates for fires with LATs is low. Now, that's a little bit confounded because they tend to be sent to the harder fires, not just the easy ones. So I think they acknowledge that in the research as well. LATs are dispatched more to around communities, which goes with the sort of findings of the papers in the previous slide. And they also acknowledge that there's no real empirical proof of effectiveness certainly in the literature or written up. And they recommend that there's improved data collection on objectives and drops. So moving on to current research and staying with the US Forest Service, and this is the Aerial Firefighting Use and Effectiveness study, which is probably the most significant study going on at the moment, and probably the most significant study on the topic in a long time. And this project, it's been underway for a few years now. But as it was starting, there was a report from their Government Accountability Office, and they sort of recommended that the Forest Service expand their efforts to collect information on the performance and effectiveness of their firefighting fleet. They wanted to see some accountability there. And so the aim of this project is to develop and implement processes, technologies, and criteria for performance measures to quantify and measure the effective use of aircraft. And they've been doing that, and they're looking at effectiveness on a continuum of different objectives and a range of scales. And they're hoping that this will be implemented in training and mission selection and execution. And they've got this three-pronged approach. Firstly, to establish trends in overall use at the national and seasonal scales. Secondly, they want to use ground-based sampling and analysis in aerial firefighting use to assess use objectives and outcomes and performance metrics. And thirdly, they want to use aerial sensors and different, I guess, technology to be able to quantitatively measure this, and particularly in terms of fire behaviour. And this report is this project is sort of due to report on its findings very soon. One thing that I sort of found in some of the work that I've looked at for this project is that they've got a really neat system for looking at drop objectives. And so these drop objectives, they've got these different categories which really sort of fit into these, I guess, groups of extinguishing fires, line production, protecting points, supporting backburns, delaying fire spread and reducing fire intensity. So I'd be really interested to see what they come up with this, and it'd be really interesting to see if we did something similar in Australia, if our results would be similar or not as well. So moving on to some current research done in Australia. The CFA have been undertaking some case studies on drop effectiveness on some Victorian fires. Tim McKern presented this at the IAWF conference last year, and I know Musa Kilnick has been doing some further case studies since. And they're looking at going out in the field and measuring stuff, but they're also looking at the data from the event tracking systems. And from that, they're also doing some fire behaviour predictions to estimate what would have happened had aircraft not been available. And from that, they've been able to make some judgments about the effectiveness of different drops and what effect they've had on the fire behaviour. And it's a really neat piece of work, and I hope they're able to continue it. Staying in Victoria, the DELP have got a new group of looking at data insights, and they're currently developing data sets to better understand how their aerial firefighting fleet is being used, And their goal is to produce sort of high quality data sets to support internal research projects around economics and performance in air-based placement. And they also plan to make these data sets available to researchers outside of the organisation to support international research, understanding the effective aircraft effectiveness, and they're pretty keen for feedback. And anyone that's interested can contact Stephen Deutsch. He's authorised that I can put his name on an email address there. Okay, so now moving on to a project that I'm working on, staying in Victoria again. This project's part of the Safer Together group of projects, and it's specifically looking at effectiveness of all firefighting resources. And I'm particularly keen to chase up tankers, trucks, and the bread and butter of our suppression in Australia. And basically because there's not much documented for them, and there's not much known. And but there are other resources that we want to look at in this project, which includes aircraft. And so the aim of the project is to evaluate the effectiveness of a wide suite of firefighting techniques and practices, both aerial and ground. We're trying to use a lot of tracking data from resources, and at the moment that is concentrated on tankers, but we probably will hopefully at some stage be able to look at aircraft as well. And if not in the scale of this project, hopefully the project will lead on to other stuff. We're trying to build a data set and a database structure that will be able to, I guess, make sense of all the data at different scales that can be collected in the field, and apply this to evaluating suppression effectiveness, and coming up with things like productivity rates and better knowledge on effectiveness thresholds, which the existing knowledge is I guess, a little bit limited and certainly applied well beyond its the conditions that it's been developed in. So we've got a little bit of another pyro page about the conditions and the need for quantification for these sorts of things. So now I'm just going to sort of finish up with a few different things here, but firstly on research utilisation. Now, I'd be pretty keen for some feedback on this, because I only know what I know, and hopefully there's a whole lot more of research utilisation out there than what I know about. But I'll sort of preface this by saying this certainly comes from an Australian perspective. And I know that some of the work that we've done has helped funding bids, and the original report that we did at the start of the CRC project helped NAFC with a major funding bid. Also, some of that rapid initial attack findings from the initial attack success modelling that we've done has helped with other things. It's helped get the message of when to apply aircraft out to sort of non-aviation specialists out there, and hopefully now they're calling for aircraft earlier. And this has also led to the predetermined dispatch type projects like the one in Victoria, and NAFC have done a really nice, AFAC have done a really nice job in writing up I guess a case study on this use of the research there. Other things like the risk containment calculator, the fire containment calculator that we came up with, that was for more a deployment application, and I don't know if it's been, I know it's been used a little bit for that, but I don't know about if it has recently. But I know other people in sort of risk planning roles have probably been more interested in over recent years. And also the drop assessment guide, I don't know how that's being used, but I'd be pretty keen to find out. Now I'll just touch on some knowledge gaps and opportunities, and in those review papers that I mentioned at the start, I've got a whole big section on that, but here's a few that are related to aircraft, and they include sort of the use of, how are we using aircraft, particularly during during extended attack and on larger fires. What are the effectiveness thresholds? It's mostly based around fire behaviour, but there are other thresholds that might be related to other variables such as fuel or weather. What are the influence of those specific variables? And I guess this is one of the reasons why we try and model stuff so that we can actually account for those inputs of how much of an influence does something like fuel have on the degree of difficulty of suppression. Productivity is not really something we've studied much before. The efficacy of different chemicals and cost effectiveness, which sort of requires a lot of that knowledge. But there are a lot of opportunities now, particularly with the current technology that's available compared to when we, I guess, first started looking into this topic. We've got tracking systems in aircraft that have got event loggers for drops and refills and that sort of thing, which are you're really giving fantastic data, like the CFA work that was mentioned a few slides back. Digital imagery is everywhere. Everyone's got a phone and can and it's taken photos everywhere. So there's that sort of information that you can put together. Hopefully soon there'll be digital air attack supervisor forms that'll be linked to other systems, and all this can feed into doing better fire reconstructions that can link the fire behaviour at wildfire operations to the suppression effort and then the outcomes. So I'll move on to a summary now. So I guess research needs to be conducted at a range of scales to look at the issues that are relevant here. The benefit of aircraft is well established during initial attack, but not so much for extended attack and on larger fires. We don't really know how aircraft are being used all the time in a sort of quantitative sense, and data from incidents is more available now, so we can take that. So I'll leave it there. And I just want to quickly take the opportunity to thank all the people that have helped me over the years. There's been a lot of operational people, certainly for collecting field data from wildfires and for setting up field experiments and that sort of thing. And, a lot of this research has been a collaborative effort, and, without those parties, we wouldn't be developing research that's hopefully relevant to answering a lot of those questions. That's a web page for the Pyro pages that I mentioned if you're interested in that sort of stuff, and I'll pass it back to you, Ewan.
Thank you very much, Matt. And just a reminder for those who are on the webinar, if you've got a question, you can click on the chat and type that up. And we've got a question here for Chris. So both Chris and Matt, if I direct a question to you, if you can unmute yourself and then respond. So Steve Forbes has said, we've seen success in using high resolution infrared gimbal on aircraft with lightning data in the aircraft to go and look proactively for new lightning fires. Are you looking to get, say, a SIG aircraft contract as part of your lightning fire response strategy? Chris?
Maybe I could just easily answer that. Short answer, yes. So we are doing, and I've touched my own people, but and I know others. I know Western Australia's got a good intel chopper and so on, because I used to work there, and I'm sure there's others in the country. But that's exactly what we're looking at. We're having conversations with providers. We might not need the intel at that level until the busier part of the season. We know we get the lightning storms usually at Christmas and then in the new year, which is January, February is our busy time. So the short answer is yes. Great suggestion though, and it might not be exactly what I've taken a note. I read that earlier, so I took a note of that, and I'm just going to pass that to the Air Ops folks as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And Lee Gleeson asked, when we consider readiness for a spike day, are we focused too much on that day rather than the preceding days? And should we therefore ramp up both aircraft and ground resources on those preceding days to ensure new starts are smashed before the spike day? I might go to you first, Chris, and then to Matt.
Again, short answer to that is yes. We have good forecasts. Well, certainly the Bureau, good enough to give us 4 days notice. We put in other controls leading into total fire bans. Again, I suspect most agencies give that consideration, but making sure there's no fire on the ground, control with our permit systems, sometimes even actually declare a total fire ban earlier to make sure that we're on top of that, because it's another weapon in our armoury. So quite right, focus on fire so we don't have ignitions. The issue is the ignitions. We know we're going to have the conditions. So I think that's, well, I know that's our current thinking, and it sounds like everyone's probably moving to that going forward. Yes, we have in the past been very reactive. Wait till it happens and throw stuff at us. We can no longer be that. We've got to be forward leaning, and that's exactly the focus I'm seeing evolve now. So thanks, Ewan.
And Matt, did you have a comment on that?
I think Chris has answered that very well.
Okay, so Kath M is saying thanks for the presentations. There's been some debate in the public domain about how many and which types of aircraft we may require into the future. She adds that she found today's suggestion very helpful. I guess it's a case of one shoe doesn't fit every situation, but I might just pose that to Matt first and then to Chris about, you know, is there any conclusion about the best types of aircraft for particular situations?
No, and I guess if you look at our use of aircraft currently, that's been, I guess, through trial and error over the years and informed by a lot of where things have worked and where they haven't. Not necessarily sort of written up in a scientific sense, but or a data analysis point of view, but certainly that, you know, coming up with similar sorts of results, you know, you could probably do that sort of thing by making measurements and things, and coming up with productivity models and comparing how they go in different environments and that, and probably fine tuning a little better. But, you know, I think a lot of the hard yards have been done already. And
Chris, you, for one of your slides, you had a wide range of aircraft.
Really important. This is a really important question for me, and I'm looking forward to. And Matt, I've written your phone number down and all. I've got a guy that's onto this. So really important for us. I've asked twice since I've been appointed, now in my 5th year, for my air ops to reappraise what our air fleet should look like. You may not be aware, I previously worked in Western Australia, and we reconfigured our air fleet there and found that sometimes it's not the big aircraft that are the answer, the combinations that occur are important. So we went to medium choppers and found them much more effective in our initial strike in WA, for example. But we use fixed wings over there in certain areas. We're precasting response and saying we want these sorts of initial attack approaches to occur, and the aircraft will be sent ahead of the curve. I'm interested in looking at the Canadairs, 600 litres versus, say, 6,000 litres versus 2 lots of 3,000 litres, say, with other fixed wings. But what we know, if you look at Tasmania's terrain compared to other states like Victoria, very flat, a lot of grassland. Tasmania, not so much grassland, lots of remote and hilly, tall timber stuff. What's the best aircraft for that? This is where Matt's inputs, and we're really interested in this level of research and level of detail. So we're reconfiguring, hopefully to use, we do have water in our lakes, a bit like the Canadians. So in the summer, so we're trying to use that. So our configuration might look different to Victoria. But I'm also really interested in that question about initial attack versus ongoing response. I think the lats are more appropriate in the latter, rather, as I illustrated, I think in one of my early slides, we found them very useful and powerful, but in initial attack, it's very easy to blow 50 grand. And that's down to the skills or understanding of my people. This is not a criticism of our industry, of our aircraft or anything. It's do we know what our capability is? So that's why it's really important to me that we understand the aircraft capability, apply them contextually to the state or the jurisdiction. And but in our case, I'll always want to have up my sleeve a NAFC option to be able to pull down a large air tanker, because we have found them very useful in certain settings as well.
Thanks, Chris. Now, I'm very conscious of the time. Lee Gleeson says we need to get aircraft out between daybreak and midday when they're going to be most effective, pointless waiting till mid-afternoon. Tony Griffiths makes the point there's plainly significant public and agency education required about the effective use of aircraft. Is this something that NAFC is addressing? Chris, is that something that NAFC is looking at?
Yeah, if it's always, well, I think I raised, it's always on our mind, and and hence some of the research that, I guess, if we think of NAFC as a collective, we pool our resourcing and the like, but we do want to know that what the most effective aircraft are, because we have those questions that get asked of us all the time. So we have a paper, I think one paper a year or so ago we did, but we want to build on that with research like what Matt's providing there.
And I might just throw to Richard Alder, who's the Executive Director of NAFC. Did you want to talk to the education point, Richard?
Thanks, Ewan. Yeah, look, very briefly, and thanks, Tony, for the question. And I think that the short answer is yes, it's something we're very, very conscious of. I might even say that perhaps, as Chris says, NAFC is a collective, and perhaps we can all take some responsibility for maybe creating some public perceptions and political perceptions about what aircraft can do as well. And we do need to be conscious of that. Look, there's a number of levels to this. I think there's a focus on the agency staff who manage, support, supervise, and deploy and dispatch aircraft. We're certainly working through that one very closely at the moment with a review of the training framework and a new approach to training of those people. There's a second focus on perhaps, if you like, the non-specialists, the people who actually utilise the aircraft, so the incident controllers, the incident management teams, the operations officers. And I'd say that's probably an area where we could collectively direct some more focus and will be a priority area in the future. And then thirdly, yes, the public and the politicians and so on. Again, I think it would be fair to say we could put more focus on that area, and I think that's, Chris would agree that that's something the NAFC Strategic Committee is certainly conscious of. Thanks, Ewan.
Great, yeah.
Thanks, both Chris and Richard. Wayne Rigg, and he's got a multi-pronged question or series of questions. What research do we need, so this is for you, Matt, to better understand when and where to use LATs? To Chris, how do we educate personnel up and down the line of command and control of when and where they should be used? Often decisions are made at a state level to send resources when they're not able to be effectively integrated. How do we address this? Matt, this sort of goes to the value proposition. Did you want to speak first and then Chris?
We've got the technology. We can, firstly, we've just got to measure stuff and record it, and then we can analyse it. And by that stuff, I mean, we've got good information about where drops are being made from the tracking systems. We can do fire behaviour reconstructions like the examples from our CFA colleagues that, and do those sorts of comparisons, work out when things are working, when things aren't. And I'm sure you could do a bunch of those on some fairly significant fires and come up with some pretty good answers that might help you fine tune how you use them.
Chris, did you want to speak to that one as well?
I was gearing up for the education thing, which I might stay with.
Okay, terrific.
So Wayne's question about the education, and I know you'd be aware how we work with Victoria in Tasmania to try and build our own capability within an understanding of aircraft. And in fact, we had, I spoke about that St Helens job, we actually got someone from New South Wales that understood the capability to see if it would work for us. And that's what we've done to date. We're working on simulation as well. So I've got a project working on simulation that can help hopefully educate our people. But yep, it's a long haul. Do we go for a centre of excellence? It's just conceptually at the moment, a centre of excellence, or continue with sharing among states to build up all the way through. There is a problem with, I think, misapplication of the resourcing, and that can only come down to understanding of the capability. How we get that is, well, it can be just by experience. I think that's how it's been in the past, but now we know stuff about it and we're learning it even more through research. We can cobble that together in programs going forward.
Thank you, Chris. Now I'm going to wind this up. We've gone a little bit over time. What we'll do, the unanswered questions will refer to the panel, and then we'll publish both the questions and the responses. Just while we were going through some of those responses, I've just gone back on Chris's slides, and we'll make the slides available to everyone, but his 7 or 8 chief officer observations and the NAFC challenges, I think, have been reiterated several times by the people who have asked questions. So could I thank everyone for attending today? Thank you for your questions. Just want to acknowledge Chris Arnold, Matt Blasinski for your presentations. There have been a number of comments online that people have been seen those as great value. So thank you. Could I thank all who have joined and those who have asked questions. A reminder of the upcoming webinar on the 13th of August, the Industry View with Phil Hurst and Ray Cronin. The survey results and the Royal Commission outcomes on the 3rd of September and the interactive workshop on the 17th of September. A reminder that the webinar has been recorded and we'll advise on the link to access the recording. Thank you all very much. And for those of you who might have been concerned, we have been practicing social distancing. And when I'm not talking, I've had my mask on. And the other people who have been supporting this have also had masks on as well. Thank you all very much. Stay safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you on the 13th of August. Thank you very much.